In this lesson, you're going to learn two new strategies, enveloping and the block-in. Both of these strategies involve drawing the basic forms of your subject using straight lines. But we can also use this technique to simplify more organic subjects that have a lot of curves. You can use your eyes and mind alone, or you can use your pencil or another measuring tool to sight the angle.
Drawing is not a talent, it's a skill you can learn. So join me in the drawing laboratory or any of my other courses at proko.com/Eviston.
So the subject we're going to block in is a shell. So first, I want you to visualize the envelope that would surround this shell. So to block in a subject like this, we first want to establish the top. So right here is going to be the very tip of the shell. Then I'm going to extend a line down to the left. The upper section of the shell seems to form a triangle. So I'm extending these lines down to the protrusions on either side of the shell. Now I'm also taking note that these two corners are not directly across from one another. They are not in horizontal alignment. Notice that this creates a triangle. Now, if we can visualize this triangle overlaid on the subject, we can get a sense of the shape of this part of the shell. From there, our envelope would come inward. I'm not sure how far down this line needs to go, so I'm going to extend it out further than I think I need. On the other side, the envelope seems like it would come in at even more of a steep angle. Now looking, I think I've angled this one in a little too much, so I'm gonna pull it out just a little bit. Now from here, our envelope is going to drop all the way down to the bottom of the shell. So I'm very lightly going to draw that line. And I'm gonna pull this line down as well. So using proportional measuring, I can see that the length of the shell is a little more than twice of the distance from the tip of the shell to this division. So I'm going to get that measurement on my pencil, pull it down, there's 1, mark it with my finger, 2, so it's going to be right about here. So I'm going to make the bottom of my envelope right here. So this is a simplified version of the shell. We've got a very basic envelope. Again, this envelope is touching the furthest edges of the shell. And you can see how this starts to embody the overall shape. Now I want to note here that I have drawn this envelope much darker than I would have if I were drawing on my own. But I just wanted to give you a sense of what an envelope can look like and how quickly and easily we can use it to get something down on the page. So once I've got my envelope, I can break this larger shape down using the block-in. So I can start to notice the smaller forms of the shell. And again, I'm still going to do this very, very lightly. Here is this first step of the shell coming up. Here is the second, and you'll note here that I am not drawing any details. I am simply blocking in the most basic version of these forms. I'm doing this incredibly lightly because, as we've discussed, these are just guidelines. These are not intended to be seen by a viewer. These are just for me to figure out the basic forms of the subject. This is what I love about this part of the drawing. I can make any corrections I want to almost immediately. So if I need to extend out a part of the drawing, I can just do that immediately. I don't need to feel frustrated or get upset with myself. This part of the drawing is incredibly malleable. I can even use the block-in to simplify these protrusions. Last one goes here. Now let's go down to the bottom of the shell. We can clearly see that the edge of the shell comes in and then curves outward on both sides. Here we have a nice curve outward, then a curve inward. Now it's so easy to draw curves too loosely and often to make them curve too much. So blocking in curves, simplifying these curved lines into straight lines and angles is a great way to get a sense of how they're structured. And when you start to think about it like this, you can really start to see the structure of the curves. So right here, this line is just barely curved. It's very easy to simplify this into a straight line because it is pretty straight. Then it dives in just a little bit. Then we have another line starts to come down this direction before coming back out and meeting the very base of the shell. So we have a form that is created almost entirely out of straight lines. We started with the large shape of the envelope, and then we started to carve away the more complex forms. So this curves in just a little bit. So I'm going to draw this cutout here, just a little bit. So 2 straight lines, one here, and up to the top. Now, as I draw the curves, I want you to notice how close the curves stay to these straight lines of the block-in. So I don't want to get too dark yet, but I'm going to start to draw the more complex shapes of these curves. And you can see how the roundness here is much more subtle than you may have thought. Now notice that I can draw these curves right over the block-in, and we can barely notice that the block-in was ever there. But you can see that these curves don't feel loose, they don't feel unruly, they feel structured and tight. Let's do the same thing over here. So again, we can just see that it's barely curving in some of these areas. You'll notice that I draw the curves individually. Here I'll make a concave line before making a convex line. So I'm not just following the contour around in one big curve. I'm constructing each part of the curve on its own. Now what I love about this technique is that it feels like I've got a scaffolding underneath these curves. With this scaffolding of these basic forms in place, I'm much more easily able to freely draw the curves. And I can do this everywhere. Once I have this larger shape figured out, it's much easier for me to go in and start to draw all of these smaller details that really start to make the drawing. I can draw all of these little peaks of the shell. And again, I have this simplified guideline underneath, so I always know what my pencil is doing and where it needs to make the strokes. I also want you to note here that I've drawn my block-in lightly enough that we can barely see it once I draw the more detailed parts of the shell over it. So hopefully at this stage you can really start to see the forms of the shell developing. I started with a simple envelope, moved to a basic block-in, and very quickly I'm able to establish the largest forms of the shell so I can get to drawing some of the more beautiful and detailed parts of it. It does not take long using these techniques. Now from here, I'm sure you can see that we can make this drawing as detailed as we want to. With these foundational forms set, I could finish this drawing to whatever degree of realism I wanted. And of course, assuming that you've drawn your envelope and block-in lines lightly, you can always go back and erase them to the point where they will barely be visible. And only a very observant viewer will be able to find that they were ever there. One of the things I love most about enveloping is that it allows us to simplify even the most complex subjects into a basic shape. Now, when I look at this subject, I think the envelope can be constructed from only 5 lines. Now, at first glance, this drawing appears to be almost entirely constructed from curved lines. But a drawing like this is actually much more structured than you may think. The block-in is just another way to draw a light foundation on the page to get the basic forms of the subject down, and eventually we will cover up this drawing with all of the dark, beautiful lines and shading and texture that will create the finished work. So once you have the large forms of your subject blocked in, you can start to block in some of the smaller forms. Now remember, the goal of the block-in is just to get the basic forms down on the page. You don't need to get too detailed. But by first simplifying this complex subject into a 5-sided shape and then breaking that shape up into straight lines that reflect the subject, we're able to get something down on the page that's really starting to resemble the subject. Now, even though this block-in may look simple, when we compare it to the subject, you can see what an excellent job it does at simplifying the forms. What you'll find is that all of these lines that you thought looked very, very curved were not as curved as once thought. These straight lines do an excellent job at structuring the drawing. It'll keep the curves in check, so you can get a sense of just how much something is curved.
Check out more from this lesson at proko.com/Eviston. My drawing laboratory course starts with the beginner's guide, moves into teaching you how to draw in 3 dimensions, tackles the art of expressive lines, and finishes with shading. You'll learn to draw simple and complex subjects at proko.com/Eviston. And you can get 20% off the drawing laboratory now for the next 2 weeks. I'll see you there.